Okay, uh, good afternoon, students. Welcome to video lecture. I think this is number 8. Today we're going to be talking about interview number 9. I'm speaking a little lower today. I'm doing some work at Arizona State University this summer, and so I'm at their library, and unfortunately the library that I went to does not have any private rooms. So I'm kind of out in the open, might be interrupted a little bit or hear some background noise. For that, I apologize. Okay, so we're going to look at the 9th interview in the text. Here's where Isa, our dialogue partner, presents a number of arguments in favor of moral absolutism. So we've heard a number of arguments in favor of moral relativism. Now we're going to get some arguments in favor of moral absolutism. A couple of points to remember as we go through this. Remember, according to Isa, we're going to be getting arguments that move from the weakest to the strongest. Okay? So the first, 2, 3 arguments he thinks are evidence in favor of the position he's defending, but they're much weaker than, say, the last 2 arguments. And so I'll try to present that in the argument as we talk about it, as we go through them. The other point that he makes, and this is a point of a nice point, and it's one of intellectual honesty, is he says that even though he thinks that he's refuted every one of the major arguments in favor of moral relativism, it doesn't follow that moral relativism is false. What follows is that none of the best arguments that have been given for moral relativism are good. Maybe there's a secret argument out there that nobody has ever presented that would demonstrate the truth of moral relativism. Obviously, Isa doesn't think that's the case, but he's being intellectually honest. And so I like that feature of this particular interview here. What he does think is this, is that intellectual honesty demands of the moral relativists the following. Either they abandon their position of moral relativism, given the refutations that he has presented, or they come up with responses to his refutations, or they come up with a new argument in favor of moral relativism. So he thinks roughly those are the 3 major options. Either you abandon moral relativism, you respond adequately to his objections to moral relativism, or you come up with a new argument, new reasons in favor of moral relativism. Now, if you don't come up with any new reasons in favor of moral relativism, and you don't respond adequately to his objections to the arguments in favor of moral relativism, then he thinks you really should, the only option you have left is to abandon it. Or at the very least, you must remain silent. You can no longer, try to persuade others, and you yourself, intellectual honesty and integrity demands that you yourself stop believing it, at least for the time being, until you can come up with better responses. But okay, so I think that's a nice position that Isa articulates there. So remember, you've got 3 options. Get rid of moral relativism, come up with responses to his objections, or come up with a new argument in favor of moral relativism. And those are really the only 3. Remember those. Okay, let's run through these arguments. I'm going to criticize Isa on a number of these, so make sure you're paying attention and writing good notes. Argument 1. We'll call this Isa calls this, I think, the argument from consequences. This is the weakest of the arguments in favor of moral absolutism. Step 1. Absolutism makes moral saints and saintly societies, he says. Step 2. If some theory makes moral saints and saintly societies, then that is a good reason to believe that theory. 3, therefore, we have good reasons to believe moral absolutism. All right, I'll represent those steps. Step 1, moral absolutism makes moral saints and saintly societies. Step 2, if some theory, X, makes moral saints and saintly societies, then that is a good reason to believe that theory is true. 3, therefore we have good reasons to believe that moral relativism is true. Okay, so now let's think about this. The argument, the conclusion isn't saying, therefore moral relativism is for sure true. It's saying you've got some good reasons for believing that moral relativism is true. Right, so he thinks he's provided you with some good reasons for thinking that moral relativism is true, namely that moral absolutism, namely that moral absolutism contributes to this particular good feature, contributes to saintliness, individuals and societies. Okay, so the basic idea behind this argument is pretty simple, right? The idea is that the consequences of ideas or the consequences of theories matter, right? So here's a good example of this. If some moral theory, let's say, implies that something like rape is permissible, let's say that, or if some moral theory implies that genocide is okay sometimes, then that's a great reason to think that moral theory is false. If you've got a moral theory or someone's presenting you with a moral theory and you say, hey, that moral theory implies that genocide is sometimes okay or child molestation is sometimes okay, that's a really bad consequence of a theory. That's an excellent reason to think that it's false. In the same way that if a theory in logic or a theory in math implies that 2 + 2 = 7, or implies that something can be both red all over, completely red, and completely blue, if a theory implies that, that's a good reason to reject those theories. Those theories have absurd consequences. A theory that implies 2 + 2 = 7, or a theory that implies that the surface of an object could be completely red and completely blue, any theory that implies those absurdities is itself an absurd theory. This is called a reductio ad absurdum. So what Issa is doing is he's saying, let's look at the consequences, the implications of a theory. He thinks the implications of absolutism are moral saintliness, and that's such a good theory that that's a reason to endorse it. Okay, so that's an interesting argument. What we'd need to do here is just do some of the empirical groundwork. Is he right that when you look at the persons that we admire, that you admire, that history has admired, that cultures have admired, are these persons moral absolutists? So, you know, we would need to do a little bit more work than he does here. You might think that what's going on here is that he's giving you a reason for thinking that absolutism is true, but maybe he's not giving the Nazi a reason for thinking that moral absolutism is true, because the Nazi might say, well, look, the people I admire are not moral absolutists. So that might be the case. This is a weak argument, but he thinks it's still evidence, right? It's evidence, it's data, right? Mother Teresa, wonderful person, moral absolutist. Jesus Christ, wonderful person, moral absolutist. You know, and the list goes on. Most of the people that you and I would agree that belong on the list of wonderful people, he thinks are going to wind up being moral absolutists. Okay, so it's interesting to think of. It might provide you with good reason for thinking that absolutism is true, even though this argument might not provide the Nazi with good reason. Let's look at argument number 2. Argument number 2 is an argument from consensus. Step 1, nearly everyone who has ever lived has been a moral absolutist. Step 1, nearly everyone who has ever lived has been a moral absolutist. Step 2, if nearly everyone believes something, then that's a good reason to think that it's true. Step 2, if nearly everyone believes something, then that's a good reason to think it's true. 3, Therefore, we have a good reason to think that moral absolutism is true. Okay, so once again, these are called probabilistic arguments. That's not a bad feature. Lots of arguments are probabilistic arguments, right? You do them all the time, every day. In the past, every time you've put your foot in front of the other one, the ground hasn't turned to water. And so that's good reason to think that when you do it today, the ground isn't going to turn to water. In the past, every time you've turned the keys to your car, in the ignition, the car hasn't blown up. That's a good reason to think that today, when you turn the keys in the ignition, the car isn't going to blow up. Those are all probabilistic arguments, and they're fine arguments, right? Most of our lives, many of the arguments that we sort of implicitly give or live according to are probabilistic in nature. That is, the conclusion, the truth of the conclusion, or the likelihood that the conclusion is true, is increased by the truth of the premises, but it's not guaranteed by the truth of the premises. Okay, so this is a probabilistic argument. It tells us you've got some good reason, once again, for believing that absolutism is true because everyone in the past has believed it. So it simply tells us that absolutism is probably true. Moral relativism is probably false. Okay, it doesn't guarantee it. That's not, and ISA isn't trying to pretend that this argument guarantees it. Maybe everyone's wrong, right? Maybe most of humanity, most of humans in all of history, maybe they're wrong about moral absolutism. But the idea is the burden of proof is definitely squarely upon the shoulders of the person who wants to disagree with literally everyone or nearly everyone. That's the idea. So suppose you're in a room and everyone is screaming, there's a rat, there's a rat, there's a rat. You don't see it. I'll tell you what, if I'm in the room and everyone is screaming, there's a rat, there's a rat, there's a rat, I'm jumping on the table and I'll probably scream along with them. Even if I don't see the rat, I'm jumping on the table, right? The fact that everyone is seeing this rat and screaming about it is going to be enough for me to think there's a rat. So that's the idea here. Isa makes another interesting point. He says that it's interesting that the moral absolutist is sort of in agreement with the common person, right? The everyday person, the person who, the high school dropout, the high school graduate, the college graduate, right? This is the view of humanity, of the common person. It's not an elitist position, right? And so it turns out, he says, that moral relativism is actually the snob elitist position, and the moral absolutist here is really the egalitarian. The moral relativist is saying, I know better than pretty much everyone in the history of humanity. The moral absolutist says, nope, I'm in agreement with pretty much everyone in the history of humanity. Okay, so that's argument number 2. It's got some legs, it seems to me. The burden of proof point, I think. Burden of proof is always a tricky issue, but it's worth thinking about, right? Suppose you're a Christian. So for those of you who are Christians, let's say you've got some worries about hell, and you think maybe, you're not sure whether or not hell is true. Well, okay, fine, investigate. But keep in mind that pretty much every single Orthodox Christian in the history of Christianity has believed in the existence of hell. It's enshrined in the most ecumenical creed. The Apostles' Creed mentions hell. And so because of that, if you're going to deny hell, you might be right. But man, the burden is on you, right, to show that this vast tradition, right, this huge, wide and deep tradition is wrong, right? So you've got some work to do. That's the idea behind argument number 2, the argument from consensus for moral absolutism. Argument number 3, this is the argument from moral experience. This is an argument that we've actually seen before, so I'm going to present it and then just move on pretty quickly. Step 1, absolutism makes sense of the data of our everyday experience of the world, and its rival does not. Step 1, moral absolutism makes sense of the data of our everyday experience of the world, and its rival does not. Step 2, if some theory makes sense of the data and the rival theory does not, then that's a good reason to think that the first theory is true. Step 2, If some theory, let's say theory A, makes sense of the data and theory B does not, then that's a good reason to think theory A is true, or it's more likely to be true than theory B. 3, therefore, we have, once again, good reason to think moral absolutism is true. And so remember, this is the data that he talks about, right? When someone punches you in the face, you think they've done something morally wrong, there's an injustice that's been committed, right? Child molestation you think is awful. Persons who commit it should be punished. Rape, genocide, stealing, lying, cheating, all of those sorts of things you generally think are wrong, and you certainly don't want persons doing it to you. That's part of the data, right? Now, ISA thinks moral absolutism makes better sense of that data than moral relativism. Okay. Argument 4. Okay, now here I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on argument 4. I don't really think ISA does enough here. I think my presentation is better. So you let me know what you think. If you disagree with me, I'm happy to hear from you. Okay. Argument 4 is the argument from moral language. So I'm gonna add a little bit to it. So here's my version of this argument. Step 1. Genuine arguments assume about X, genuine arguments about X, about something. X is just like a pronoun or a variable, right? So genuine arguments about X assume that there are facts about X that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc. Step 1. Genuine arguments about X assume that there are facts about X that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc. Step 2. We have genuine arguments about morality. Step 2, we have genuine arguments about morality. 3, hence, there are facts about morality that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc. 4, if there are facts about morality that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc., then moral absolutism is true. 4, if there are facts about morality that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc., then moral absolutism is true. 5, therefore moral absolutism is true. Okay, so I'm going to go through and just talk about each one of those steps really quickly. And then I want to explain some stuff that I think ISA didn't go into on moral disagreement. Okay. Step 1, genuine arguments about X assume there are facts about X that hold independently of our beliefs, feelings, culture, etc. The idea is this, that when you have a genuine argument about something, say about the shape of the universe, the age of the universe, the existence of God, the moral permissibility or impermissibility of abortion, when you engage in arguments about that, what you're doing is you're assuming, sorry, I don't know what to do here. Whatever. All right, so when you engage in arguments about something, what you're assuming is that there's a fact out there, and that the reasons you're giving are reasons to think that is true, that fact obtains, that it exists, right? So you think that God exists, and you give some reasons for thinking it. The very process or idea of giving reasons for something suggests that you think that that something, God exists, God doesn't exist, souls don't exist, free will exists, free will doesn't exist, whatever. The very giving of reasons you think are pointing us to a truth that obtains independently of us, right? So those reasons are sort of like investigative. They're paths to the truth. That's the whole point of an argument. So you give arguments in physics and biology and chemistry and psychology. We think those reasons are going to get us to the facts. Those reasons are going to get us to the truth about the world, right? And so whenever we give reasons for something or engage in argumentation about something, we're presupposing that the thing we're arguing about is something that those reasons are going to point to, right? That the argument we're giving is going to get us closer to the truth. So we're assuming that there's a truth out there, and we're trying to figure out what it is. And the arguments are supposed to help us figure out what it is. So the idea is the very process of arguing for something presupposes that that something is objective, that it exists independently of us, independently of our beliefs, our feelings, our desires, our culture. Well, Isa says, look, it sure looks like we have genuine arguments about morality, right? It sure looks like we do. And so if that's the case, then we're all assuming that there is such a thing as objective morality. That's moral absolutism. So let's look at number 2. I'm going to give an argument for number 2. Okay, so this is an argument in defense of number 2. Remember, step 2 is that we have genuine arguments about morality. Okay, step 2 is we have genuine arguments about morality. Here's an argument for that claim. Step 1. So this is, maybe in your notes you'd write, argument in defense of 2, of premise 2. Step 1, if there are no genuine moral arguments, then moral argument is impossible. That is, giving reasons for moral claims is meaningless. Right? So if there's no such thing as a genuine moral argument, then moral argument's impossible. Giving reasons for moral claims is meaningless. Step 2, but it's not impossible. Right? We give arguments, reasons for moral claims all the time. And we change about our minds about those issues. Okay, so step 1 in the argument in defense of 2 is if there are no moral arguments, then moral argument is impossible. If there's no genuine moral arguments, then moral argument is impossible. That is, giving reasons for moral claims is meaningless. 2, but it's not impossible, it's not meaningless. 3, then therefore there really are genuine moral arguments. Okay. Now here's a very important point. Okay, so that's done. I'm done with the argument in defense of step 2. Now, what I want to say here is this. There's a couple of things I want to say. Okay, this is very, very, very important. One of the biggest arguments in favor of moral relativism is the argument from disagreement. And you got that argument from Libby. It was in the form of the argument from culture, right? That cultures disagree about morality. But there's also, disagreement amongst individuals. And so a lot of people think this. And look, it seems to me this is probably one of the best, maybe the best, I don't know, argument in favor of moral relativism. And Isa probably could have done or should have done a better job in presenting and attacking this argument. So the argument goes like this. Look, there's disagreement everywhere, right? There's scientific disagreement, all sorts of disagreement, but it seems like those types of disagreement are resolvable, right? That we can reach a solution that everyone agrees upon. There's arguments about morality. There's arguments about goodness, about love, about justice, about badness and evil. There's arguments about rightness and wrongness, right? There's arguments about all sorts of things in morality. It seems like consensus isn't reached, right? That the arguments persist, that they're not resolvable. So it looks like there's a radical difference between arguments for moral claims and arguments for non-moral claims, and that leads some people to think that morality is thereby very different from non-morality. Namely, it's not about something that exists outside our heads. It's just about our preferences and our tastes and our feelings. Okay, so that's powerful, it seems to me, this argument from disagreement, but I think the moral absolutist can explain this in a satisfactory way. So here's one, okay? If there really is disagreement, then there can't be genuine disagreement about something that isn't objective. There can't be genuine disagreement about my own subjective psychological states, right? So if morality is really just about my own desires and beliefs and feelings and preferences, then there can't be any disagreement about it, right? So if I tell you if I say to you that capital punishment is morally wrong, well, if moral relativism is true, then what I've stated is true. Capital punishment is morally wrong, says David. Or David feels that capital punishment is morally wrong. That's true, right? Pretending that's my position on capital punishment. You don't know my position on capital punishment. Let's pretend. Then it's true, right? I've just successfully articulated my position on capital punishment. And if moral relativism is true, that's really all there is. just David's positions and Francisco's positions and Julian's positions and so on and so forth, right? So, well, then the person who says, look, I think capital punishment's morally permissible, well, that person has also said something true. They've said, I, Francisco, or Sarah think that moral or capital punishment is morally permissible. That's all they've told us when they've said capital punishment is morally permissible. They've just sort of given voice to their own position. But then we're not in disagreement, right? We're not in disagreement. It's true that David thinks that capital punishment is impermissible. It's true that Sarah or Francisco thinks that capital punishment is permissible, right? And that's not a disagreement. Those are both true, and those can both be true at the same time. So in order for there to be real disagreement, it looks like that it can't be subjective. It has to be, real disagreement presupposes a kind of objectivity. Okay, so if there's genuine disagreement, then morality is objective. That's sort of the argument that we've been considering. All right, well, still there's something uneasy, right? Moral disagreement persists. It goes on and on. Well, let's think about this. So I'm going to give you 2 additional responses to this. First response, is it really surprising that moral disagreement persists? That it's very difficult to reach moral agreement? Is that surprising? It doesn't seem to me that this is surprising at all. Think about it like this. What is your life organized around? Most of us, our lives are organized around the things we value, the things that we think are important, right? So the center of my life are those things that I hold dear, right? The things that sort of motivate me, that give meaning and flavor, depth, purpose, significance to my life. Those most important things in my life, those are things that are typically related to morality, related to purpose, to value. And so if you disagree with me on those, then is it surprising that I'm gonna resist? Because in order for me to come to your side, think what has to happen, what has to change. The very center of my life has to change. The very things that my life has been organized around have to change, right? So that would result in radical change everywhere else. If the center changes, then everything around that center is going to change or start feeling and looking different. So if you've organized your life around belief in God and someone is trying to convince you that God doesn't exist, it's right for you to have reluctance, right? Your whole life is organized around this idea. And so change should take a significantly longer time than if someone tries to convince you that the Dallas Cowboys did not win the 1975 Super Bowl. Suppose you think, yeah, I think the Cowboys won the 1975 Super Bowl, and someone says, nope. And then they show you a book or an encyclopedia, whatever, and you say, oh, yep, you're right. You can change your mind about that in a second. Why? Because it's not something that structures, that organizes, that gives depth and meaning and significance to your life. So moral disagreements are typically disagreements of that kind. Disagreements about central commitments, central beliefs. Those are disagreements about things that characterize and guide your behavior in really deep ways. Whereas disagreements about who won the Super Bowl in 1975 are not. Think about mathematical disagreements. Look, I was a math major in college. I love math. But nevertheless, I mean, people's lives, typically, most of our lives do not change because of a change in, the foundations of mathematics or number theory or something along those lines. So disagreements in mathematics are easier to resolve. People aren't they're not digging in their heels. Now, I can point to you to some mathematical disagreements that took hundreds and hundreds of years to resolve. The calculus, disagreements about infinitesimals, because people thought those were connected to things like God's existence and morality and human immortality and all sorts of really, really important issues. So when math comes close to those issues that are central in our lives, then disagreement takes a long, long time. And there's still areas in math where that kind of disagreement persists. Okay, so why does it seem like moral disagreements are radically different than non-moral disagreements? One reason I've just given you is that moral issues are more central to our lives than non-moral issues, and so it makes sense that we'd be more reluctant to change our minds on those issues. A second point about moral disagreement is this: it's just false that moral disagreement is irresolvable. Think about American culture. My guess is 200 years ago, you ask people, what do you think about the moral status of black persons? People would say all sorts of things that today we find morally wrong, morally heinous and despicable. Think about consensus regarding the personhood of Jews or women, right? The equality of women. All sorts of issues people have changed their minds about. Now, it doesn't follow that those changes were for the good. Maybe we've changed our minds about a moral issue and we're wrong about it. Okay, last point. So second point is it's false that moral disagreement is irresolvable, that it can never be resolved. It just takes a very, very, very long time. But we can point to historical cases where moral consensus has emerged, right? Okay. Lastly, the last thing I want to talk about here is this. Only the moral absolutist can think they're fallible about morality. Only the moral absolutist can say, I might be wrong. I might be wrong about abortion. I might be wrong about capital punishment. I might be wrong about whether smoking weed is morally okay. Only the absolutists can think they're wrong. Why? Because they think that there are facts that exist independently of us, and our job is to conform our mind to those facts that exist independently of us. Right? So the job is to get the mind to conform to the facts. But we could be wrong, right? So my job is to get my mind to conform to the fact of the shape of the earth. My job is to get my mind to conform to the truths about elementary arithmetic. Some of you are in nursing. Your job is to discover the truth about various, physical ailments, combinations of medicines, and so on and so forth, right? You need to know some of those. You could be wrong. We could be wrong, right? So the moral absolutist says, yeah, I could be wrong about morality. The moral relativist can't be wrong, because moral relativism says what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad just depends upon me. So if I believe it, it's true. Or if the culture I live in believes it, it's true. Okay, so let's move on now to argument number 5. This is the argument from self-contradiction. I think Isa's argument here, his initial presentation, I'm going to critique. All right. Argument 5. Argument from self-contradiction for moral absolutism. Step 1. Absolutism is essential to morality. Step 1. Absolutism is essential to morality, he says. Step 2. He says moral relativism is the denial of absolutism. Moral relativism is the denial of absolutism or moral absolutism. Step 3, therefore moral relativism is the denial of morality. Step 3, therefore moral relativism is the denial of morality. Step 4, therefore moral relativism is self-contradictory. So the idea is that moral relativism is supposed to be a moral claim that ends up not being a moral claim, ends up denying morality. It's supposed to tell us all about morality and tells us and winds up contradicting itself. It's sort of like a sentence that says, this sentence is not in English. So think about that sentence for a second. This sentence is not in English. In order for that sentence to be true, it has to be false. Okay, so that's basically the idea here. Here's my problem with this argument, and I'll bet you many of you already can identify the problem with this argument. So here's an objection from me. Step 1 looks like it's question begging. The only person who would agree with step 1, it seems, would be the moral absolutist. You'd have to already be a moral absolutist in order to accept step 1. Step 1 says absolutism is essential to morality. Okay. So it looks like it begs the question. So I'm going to present now 2 different versions of the argument from self-contradiction. One version I think is better than the other. So these are arguments you will not find in the text. Just like the previous stuff I said about the 4th argument, you won't find much of that you won't find in the text, but you still need to know this stuff. Okay, so let's look at, here's different version number 1. So this is a different version of argument 5, and this is different version number 1. Different version number 1. Step 1. If moral relativism is true, then no moral claims are true independent of culture or personal opinion. Step one, if moral relativism is true, then no moral claims are true independent of culture or personal opinion. Step two, moral relativism itself claims to be true independently of culture or personal opinion. Step two, moral relativism itself claims to be true independently of culture or personal opinion. Three, moral relativism is a moral claim. Three, moral relativism is a moral claim. Four, therefore moral relativism is self-contradictory. Therefore moral relativism is self-contradictory. Okay, so there's an argument, a different argument from self-contradiction. This is different from the one Isa presents. I think this is a better argument than the one Isa presents, but I still don't think this argument is perfect. I think there's room to doubt with respect to this argument. I'm not certain what to think of this argument. Right? It's my argument, but I'm not convinced that it's great. I'm not convinced it's bad. So let's go through it. Step one. If moral relativism is true, then no moral claims are true independent of culture or personal opinion. That's true by definition. So number one is really safe, right? Number one is just a definition, right? It's one of the, it's like the essence of moral relativism. Number one is stating the essence of moral relativism. Number two, so number one is good. No one's going to deny number one. Moral relativists, moral absolutists, they're all on board with number one. Number two, moral relativism itself claims to be true independently of culture or personal opinion. So that's, I think, true. I think very, sophisticated, thoughtful moral relativists are going to embrace that claim. What is that claim saying? Well, it's saying this. It's saying, look, moral relativism is true. Step two is saying, look, if you're a moral relativist, then you think moral relativism is true. But if you think it's true, you think it's true independently of culture or personal opinion. You think it's true objectively if you're a moral. You think moral relativism is true for everyone. It's true for the whole universe. So moral relativism is true is going to be a claim that's true for everyone at all times and all places. It's always been true, is true today, and will always be true tomorrow. So if you're a moral relativist, you think that the truth of moral relativism doesn't depend on culture, right? You couldn't say it depends on culture, the truth of moral relativism, because if you did, then the moral absolutist would say, well, there's cultures that deny moral relativism, so then moral relativism is false in some cultures, and if moral relativism is false in even one culture, then it's false in all cultures. Because if moral relativism is false in one culture, then that means moral absolutism is true in a culture. But if moral absolutism is true in a culture, then moral absolutism is true for everyone, because that's what moral absolutism says. So the moral relativist can't say that the truth of moral relativism is culturally dependent or personally dependent. They have to say the truth of moral relativism itself is something that is objective. It's universal. It holds for everyone at all times and all places. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If not, rewind. So step two looks really good. I think sophisticated, thoughtful moral relativists are going to embrace it. Now, step three is the controversial one. So put a star next to step three. Step three says moral relativism itself is a moral claim. That's the one that I'm not sure about. So moral relativism is itself a moral claim. I don't know. I mean, so in some sense, it seems like this is false. Right, so the idea is we've got moral claims. So let's say this is like a circle. Maybe write a circle in your notes, and inside the circle write moral claims. So what are the standard moral claims? Standard moral claims are abortion is permissible, or abortion is impermissible, or capital punishment is okay, or capital punishment is not okay. Physical violence is permissible sometimes, or physical violence is impermissible sometimes. Those are standard moral claims that people hold to. And moral relativism sure as heck isn't one of those. But, so it looks like you've got this circle, and inside the circle are moral claims, and then moral relativism and moral absolutism, those are ideas, those are claims about that circle. Right? They're theories about the claims in the circle. The moral relativist says all those claims in that circle are relative from person to person or culture to culture. The moral absolutist says all those claims in that circle are either true or false, independently of culture. They're not relative to culture or the individual. So it looks like moral relativism and moral absolutism are not themselves moral claims, but they're meta-moral claims. They're claims about moral claims. That seems pretty good. However, here's a worry about that. You might think, yeah, but moral relativism and moral absolutism have implications for moral claims. So in other words, if moral relativism is true, then the claim murder is morally wrong or stealing is morally wrong now is going to only be true if you agree, and it's false if you don't. So it looks like moral relativism has deep connections to those claims in the circle, and you might think that the only kinds of propositions that could have implications regarding those claims in the circle are propositions or claims that are themselves in the circle. If it's a claim outside the circle, then it can't have implications for those claims in the circle. So the fact that moral relativism has implications for the claims inside the circle, you might think, makes it itself a moral claim. So I don't know. Fascinating reasons can be given for the acceptance of premise 3, and fascinating reasons can be given for the denial. So I think this argument is a better one than the one ISA presents. Nevertheless, it's got some problems. Let's look at now different version number 2. Different version number 2. So we're looking at the argument from self-contradiction, and now we're going to look at a different version of that argument. We'll call it different version number 2. Step 1. If there is such a thing as morality, then there are types of action that are never permissible to perform. Step 1. If there is such a thing as morality, then there are types of action that are never permissible to perform. Step 2. If moral relativism is true, then there are no types of action that are never permissible to perform. Step 2. If moral relativism is true, then there are no types of action that are never permissible to perform. 3. Therefore, if moral relativism is true, then there's no such thing as morality. And then we get our self-contradiction claim. 3. Therefore, if moral relativism is true, then there's no such thing as morality. Okay, so now what's going on in this version, different version number 2, is it's actually just a defense of step 1 in the original argument. Remember, the original argument was absolutism is essential to morality, and we said, hey, that begs the question. Okay, it does beg the question just stated as is, but if we give reasons for step 1, then we've got now an argument for why absolutism is essential to morality, and we're no longer begging the question. So let's look at this. I think this is a better argument. Here's why. What premise 1 says is that, hey, here's just the essence of morality, or here's an essential feature of morality. An essential feature of morality, if there is such a thing as morality, is this. If there is such a thing as morality, then there are certain types of actions that are never permissible to perform. Now, you might think, hey, there's no such thing. There's no type of action that's never permissible to perform. In other words, for every type of action, it's possible that that action is permissible to perform in some circumstance. That's fine. If you think that, then what this step 1 is saying is that you're just denying the existence of morality. So think about it like this. Step 1 is saying, look, let's think about this notion of morality. Let's compare morality to etiquette. Let's compare morality to, social mores. Let's compare morality to law. Step 1 is saying, look, it sure seems like morality is different from etiquette. It sure seems like morality is different from chess rules. It sure seems like morality is different from, mere laws, driving on the right, driving on the left, speed limits and things like that. So step 1 is saying, it's trying to give you an essential feature of morality. Now, step 2 is telling us that the moral relativist has to deny that central feature of morality. Right? It's saying that the moral relativist has to say that for any type of action, there could be reasons to perform that action. So take any type of action you want. Rape, child molestation, genocide, torture, racism, eating your children, torturing your children, drowning your children, whatever, right? Think about terrible things. Step 2 is saying the moral relativist has to be committed, is committed to saying that for any type of action, there are circumstances, or it's possible that that action could be permissible to perform. So if that's true, then it looks, and step one is true, then moral relativism is committed to denying an essential feature of morality. So moral relativism must deny morality, and then moral relativism is self-contradictory. Strikes me as a better argument for self-contradiction than the one Isa gives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's look at the last argument that Isa gives in favor of moral absolutism. The last argument that Isa gives in favor of moral absolutism, he thinks these last two, remember, are the strongest of his arguments. This is the argument from practical contradiction. Here's my version of that. Step one. Moral relativism, he says, cannot be consistently practiced. Okay, what that means is the moral relativist, there's no consistent moral relativist, Isa thinks. Step two, if something can't be consistently practiced, or if some theory, let's put it like this, if some theory has implications that cannot consistently be carried out, then that theory is false. 3, hence, moral relativism is false. And then, of course, 4, if moral relativism is false, then moral absolutism is true. 5, therefore, moral absolutism is true. The idea here is that moral relativism, Isa says, can't be consistently practiced because the moral relativists advocate that they live lives as if there are rights and wrongs. So here's an example. Suppose I fail you for a test that I never gave you, or I fail you for a test about stuff that we never read or even talked about. Right, so suppose I send you a test and the test is all on differential equations and mathematics. You all fail this test and you all fail my class. Is that permissible for me to do? Do you think that's okay? So I think most of you would say no. So in that case then, his point is that the moral relativists will scream out injustice, injustice, when maybe they are the victims of a perceived injustice, and their moral relativism, he thinks, goes out the window in those moments. And so it isn't consistently livable. We might call that a livability test. Is it livable? And he thinks it's not, and that's an excellent reason. He thinks that's an airtight reason to reject it. Okay. So now I want to end, we're basically done with the meat of the book. Interview 10 is really interesting. I'll give a small little lecture on that, but I think there's a mic drop moment here that I want to talk about that is never talked about, and I think this is a mistake, right? So here's a mic drop moment. Many of my students, and a number of you have pointed this out, that, man, maybe it's like, poor Libby. Libby is this, former philosophy student, but she's not a professor. Isa's a professor. He's well educated. He's very articulate and smart. He's kind of a jerk. Libby's much sweeter and nicer, maybe. She seems like kind of a victim. Isa seems kind of like an oppressor in some ways. And so a lot of you think, this is not fair. It's not okay. It's not fair that Isa beats up on this student. Couple of things to be said here. One is, just like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, rise to her defense. Give some responses to these arguments. The other thing I want to say is this. Here's the mic drop. Okay, so if you think that this isn't fair, you're presupposing the truth of moral absolutism, because you think that there's this objective truth about it being unfair for this highly educated person to beat up on this uneducated or less than educated person. There's some kind of injustice. So the very structure of the dialogue we're looking at, this seemingly unfairness, points us straight towards moral absolutism. Okay, I'm going to give one more argument. This is not found in the text. I'm going to present it informally. Here's the idea. Call this argument 7. And argument 7 is from cultural contradiction. Here's how this argument goes. For each person is a member of multiple cultures. The cultures that person represents often have conflicting views on what is morally right, morally wrong. If moral relativism is true, then that person has to both affirm and deny regarding some moral claim. In other words, that person has to think that that moral claim is both true and false. No claim can be both true and false. Therefore, moral relativism is false. Okay, that's informal. Don't write that down in steps. Just get the basic idea. Here's the basic idea. So I am a member of multiple cultures. One of the cultures I'm a member of is I'm a member of the American culture. I'm also a member of the Jewish culture. I'm also a member of the Hispanic culture. My family, my maternal grandparents immigrated from Mexico. So I've got lots of cultures represented. Now, one of my cultures thinks that, let's say, premarital sex is okay. Another one of my cultures thinks that premarital sex is not okay. Now, if moral relativism is true, then for me, premarital sex is both permissible and impermissible. It's both okay and not okay. But of course, nothing can be both okay and not okay. So moral relativism implies a contradiction, or at least cultural moral relativism implies a contradiction. So that's a different argument than was presented in the text. It's an interesting one. I'd love for you to think about it. What would you say in response? That's it for today.